Mahima started her career in advertising and PR in Nepal. She soon found herself following an unlikely and curiosity-driven career path. By the way, curiosity is one of my favorite things. And my assertion to you is it's one of your most valuable resources as a coach. So we'll be coming to that. So she first went into branding, then into crisis communications, then coaching, creating jobs and roles that would solve interesting challenges. With an extensive background in coaching individuals and organizations through crisis, Mahima works with entrepreneurs, innovators, activists, and changemakers, bringing bright people together to solve complex problems. So will you please put your hands together and welcome my first guest, Mahima Shrestha. Mahima, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, so it's all working great. Everyone, can you just unmute yourselves and give Mahima a big round of applause?
Hi. It's lovely to see all of you.
Yeah, it's really great, isn't it? And are you in Bristol?
Yes, at the moment I am in Bristol.
Very good, very good. And thank you for being here with us today. And where I like to start these conversations is with the question, what first sparked your interest in coaching from a principal's perspective?
I have to say coaching at all was not on my radar. I didn't set out with interest or aspiration in that direction. I had studied psychology many moons ago, and at the time that I was studying it, I dropped psychology for economics in my final year because what I was studying was not true to my experience of people. It did not capture the range and depth and beauty of human beings that I had hoped to encounter and deepen my understanding of. So anyway, I dropped psychology, went off and did PR and advertising and publicity. And so at the time that I first came across coaching from this understanding we call the principles behind clarity, I was working in crisis. So I had started in PR, and then one fine day, one of my clients, their office got bombed. And so it wasn't a choice to work with people in crisis. It kind of came to my door and, and so that's how I got into really the coaching space, because I could see that in crisis, human beings, yes, we need training and protocols and practical pieces of information, but we also need a depth of knowledge and certainty about our own resilience, about our wisdom, about our creativity. And that was really a missing piece, certainly in my education, in crisis and PR. Just the human being. What I discovered as I started in that was that, some of my clients were in aviation, some of them were in the energy sector. What I discovered was that something would happen, right? A plane blows up in the sky, an office blows up. And really reasonable, kind, warm, interesting people, they get stressed. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of people turn up at their door and shove some cameras and mics in their face, and they do the dumbest shit.
Yeah.
I just could not compute. I mean, this question of like, what the hell is up with people? And it was not a new question for me. During my young adult years, Nepal had a decade-long civil war. And that too had brought to my mind this question of what the hell is up with people, and so like re-encountering people in crisis kind of really reinvigorated that question for me. And I started to try to understand what happens within us, because I could see that presentation skills and training protocols were not going to solve the more fundamental challenges of stress and wisdom, feeling cornered versus creativity. Like I really saw room for a deeper understanding for myself, really, of us. And so it was around that time that I think I was transiting at an airport, maybe Singapore, I can't quite remember now. But the first edition of your book, Clarity, was on the shelves. And I did not purchase it then, but I flipped through it.
Outrageous performance.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
I apologize.
I'm teasing.
But there was something in there about 100% of my experience or of my feelings as a result of my thinking. It was much more clearly articulated. But that line had really struck me. And I think that has been kind of the hallmark for me of my own journey with this understanding, that something struck a chord that I was not conscious of. I was not looking for it. I wasn't wanting or trying to understand it. But in wondering, just that quality of wondering about something, of a kind of, I don't know, just a connected curiosity about something. Like I remember when my niece was little, I wasn't trying to understand her or figure her out, but I was just kind of taken by her. I was happy to just look and wonder and enjoy. And it was kind of like that. That's just where I was with that. It was kind of at the back of my mind and I was curious. And then I had a personal experience of what happens to human beings in crisis, because I might not have said yet, but I'm from Nepal. And in April of 2015, we had a big earthquake in Nepal. And it was around the same time, I just kind of started doing a lot more work in crisis. I was wondering about people. This line had kind of struck me. And then here we were in the middle of this earthquake. And this is the crazy thing about earthquakes that nobody told me, which is that you have an earthquake and then you have aftershocks, except that they're way terrible because they continue to be intense, but also frequent, right? And so then we continue to have aftershocks for days. And I think it was 2 weeks later that finally the frequency slowed down, right?
What was the frequency like for the first couple of weeks?
Oh, every 10, 15 minutes. Every 10, 15 minutes, you'd hear like either it sounded like something exploded under the ground, or it would be a large shake, or it would be... when the first earthquake finished, there was like the sense of like relief and taking stock, of like, okay, we're alive. We can look around. We can see what. Nobody in our entire earthquake education told us that shit doesn't stop shaking for days. It was insane.
And that's just the beginning.
Yeah, right.
And it was a big earthquake, right?
Oh my God!
Thousands of people were killed. The buildings knocked down.
Yeah. And I mean, it was a devastating earthquake for Nepal, and it was really in the middle of that so much came together in the sense of this question of what's up with us, like what's up with us people, and this question of thinking and feeling and how we generate our life experience. So, I'm walking around pacing my living room because we were all sleeping in the lounge, because that's the place with the flattest, shortest distance to the exit, right? And so we're all sleeping in the lounge. And during the day, we're all kind of hanging out close to doors. Yeah, and so here I am, just pacing in the living room, and my niece, who was I think 3, maybe 4 at that time, she's having this conversation with her dolls, right? And she's just in the corner over there, and she's letting her dolls know that it's not shaking right now, so they don't need to freak out no more, right? And so this is happening on the side at the same time as I'm kind of pacing and wondering about this, like, can it be that 100% of what I'm feeling right now is coming from my thinking? Is that possible? And so these things are happening simultaneously. I'm wondering, and I see that, like in her world, that thinking does not exist. And so in her world, she doesn't have to panic when it's not shaking. Whereas in my world, I did have to panic whether it was shaking or not. And I could see for myself that my panic was not coming from the shake that stopped 15 seconds ago, but that I had all this volume of thinking. I had images from the news, I had what ifs, I had memories from previous shakes and all of the worries I had at that time. I was carrying this enormous volume of thinking that I didn't know was thinking. And it just looked to me like that's what life is right now. And so it was really kind of in that moment, really having this personal insight into, oh my God, this is what happens to people. This is what happens to us in crisis, but it's also what happens to us all the fucking time. We just don't know. And so I could taste this sense that buried underneath all of our thinking is this tremendous possibility and lightness and kindness that I just never knew. I thought you had to find those things, you had to make those things, I just didn't know that they were here. And in not knowing that, I didn't know how built I am for this reality, for whatever's going on. So that really for me was my first encounter of what we call insightful understanding, right? It was something that I'd read. I mean, I cognitively maybe thought about it, but it really hit me. And in being kind of struck by that, it kind of showed me all of this possibility that already was here. I just didn't know it was here. And so that really was the beginning of me understanding something so fundamental about human beings. As a coach, as a trainer, as a person, and also about the world, about the reality we live in, about what we have going for us, that I just didn't know. I thought what you had going for you was what you made, or what you did I just didn't know. I didn't know that about me or about my clients or about our world.
I just love that, Mahima. And while I've heard your story before, I never heard about your niece and her comforting the dogs. That's amazing. That's amazing. And I love that. How did you start to see that play out with your coaching clients and with the people that you were supporting in their crises?
That's a good question, because it's going back a few years. But I think fundamentally it changed what I understood about human beings. I mean, I didn't realize that before, but my thinking about human beings before was that we are kind of delicate, vulnerable, fragile things. And certainly in a crisis, like I was really struck by the fact that in that earthquake situation, I thought we were vulnerable, exposed, all of those things, right? And I didn't know that I thought I had thinking, that I had vulnerable thinking, I had exposed thinking. I didn't know that. And in seeing that in myself, there was just, at the starting, just an ease in encountering people who had thinking, because I knew what I was encountering was thinking, right? And I knew that it's okay, at some point they might see, but they already have this possibility for ease, for wisdom. And it just allowed me to take to sit back and enjoy them and to invite them to quiet, and we became in some ways co-workers.
Well, I like the way you put that. And it's funny because one of the things I see with a lot of coaches is a kind of almost like a cross between an eagerness and an anxiety to help the person, to make it to, and it's really, really founded in something positive, which is really wanting the other person to get what they came for and be okay and that sort of thing. But when I heard you talking about kind of sitting back and being like a working partner, that really chimes for me, like when we'll be talking about this later in the weekend, but when I'm working with someone, because I know that the strongest card either of us have is that capacity for wisdom and insight and creativity and peace and all of that, I'm kind of hanging out with them going, wonder when it's going to show up and wonder how. And it's almost like I was coaching someone on Friday, last Friday, a week ago. This conversation is not going any further till I get the calendar right. I was coaching someone and they had one of those insights around something that had been a big problem for them, a big health challenge. And they suddenly had that insight. My experience of it was a kind of like, well, will you look at that? It's worked again. So it's always kind of surprising and miraculous to me, but it's also kind of, I think of them almost as dependable miracles. Like because it's a function of how we're made, you can rely on it. So anyway, I just really chimed with when you said about sitting back and being a work partner. I really chimed with that description of it. Well, and you said I didn't realize when we were chatting before this session, you said to me that your participation in Clarity certification training was at the beginning of your journey as a coach. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that was the starting point. Will you talk about how it developed from there and your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, coaching was not something that was on my radar. And at this point in April 2015, I had my personal insights. And I hadn't really decided anything at that point about what that means with reference to work. It just meant that whatever I was doing at work, I was different. But it was not ever something at that point that I had thought of formalizing into a coaching practice or even formally taking it into my work. And the earthquake happened in April, and you and I had a conversation soon after that. And then in September, I was at CCT in London. And I mean, certainly up to that point, I hadn't thought of myself as a coach or thought of doing any coaching. I came because I was struck by what I saw and what I had begun to understand. And I wanted to deepen that understanding for myself. And I don't even know at what point that happened. But at some point, it translated for me from being something that impacted me and that kind of shows up wherever I happen to be, into discovering that I had, for example, pitched to several of my crisis clients that actually this is a module we really need to begin with. And so even though that's not in the planning, it's not in the budget, this is something we need to really factor in. And in having those conversations, realizing that, I need a way to say what it is that I'm offering or what it is that I'm suggesting. And that began the professional journey of kind of leaning into my own way of articulating, leaning into what does it mean to pitch and package and sell and host and, this whole world that I had just never, I never peeked in there even. And the CCT was the beginning of that process of realizing I wanted to have wider conversations directly about this or in this direction, and B, that I could, that really there was enough ingenious creativity in me and whoever I was speaking to, that if something struck a chord, we'd figure out a way to make something happen with that. Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt you. I've got a question, but I think I was interrupted.
No, go.
Well, in fact, I've got a couple of questions, but are you okay to take questions from the group here as well? Because we've got like absolutely 75 people here. I bet that people absolutely have, I know when I interviewed you about your earthquake experience in front of the audience in London back then, people had all kinds of questions because it was kind of like, oh, so this understanding works for real stuff as well. And so if you've got questions for Mahima, just put your hand up, but I've got a couple more for you. The first one is what I heard you say was like, there's enough ingenious wisdom in me and the other person to find something. Can you just say something more about that? Because that's so what I'm interested in and pointing to and looking at.
I mean, the thing is, I didn't know that about people.
Right.
Now, I grew up in PR and advertising, and I was good at pitching, but I didn't know that there was a possibility for something fresh and not entirely only of my thinking. I didn't know that. And so it was a kind of, I don't know, a refreshing kind of journey to discover, I actually don't know. And they don't know either. But if we have a conversation and they ask me some questions, I ask them some questions, we might find that there's something we could do together. And if we find that, then we'll figure it out. Like I really had come from this world where you package things to pitch. And you think of what the best way to articulate might be, you think of what their perspectives might be and where they're most likely to be swayed. I had come from that world and coming to something that really was just so close to my heart that I couldn't approach it in that way.
I love that you've put it like that, because I've had a very similar experience, which is that as my understanding has deepened, and it's very much something of the heart, how I sell, market, promote, engage clients, all of that has had to change along with it. But it's for me, one of the when you said I was good at pitching and that sort of thing, I wasn't. I used to be terrible at it because I really disliked it, and now I love having enrollment conversations and that sort of thing because it is of the heart, and because we're leveraging that ingenuity and creativity and wisdom and capacity for connection that's there in all of us. So I love that. I've got one other question, which is, what's some of the impacts you're seeing with your clients as you're sharing this with them? What are some of the ways you're helping them?
Well, I kind of get led back to something you said, right, about creating the conditions, really. And so the way I think about impact has really changed because this work has continued to surprise me, and continued to let me know that it's really not my business what changes people make or are able to make or are capable of making. And in some ways, not even what changes I'm capable of making for myself. It's all in the realm of like, not in my business really, but what is in my business is that quality of presence and question and curiosity. But in terms of what has changed for people as we've worked together, I mean, in some ways it's a disservice too, because only the more dramatic ones stand out when it's situations like this. But the truly miraculous for me are always just the small daily things, something that I found hard or they found hard for years and years and years, that suddenly got so simple, they didn't even notice. They didn't tell me until like 7 months later to say, actually, I used to find that really hard. Or actually, somebody who'd seen me before said, you're really different with that. Like that like slipperiness is just for me where the crazy part of this is really. But coming back to impact, so I did a lot of work at one stage. So this is a little bit of backstory, because I started in crisis. And I didn't start out to coach people, really.
Mm.
I wanted to improve lives of people at moments in their lives or working lives when they encountered a crisis. That was really where my interest was. And so when I first started bringing this into my professional work, I really wanted to just know, like, what does it do for people? Mm. And so I picked some arenas where I genuinely didn't know. And that was part of why it had to be conversations rather than pitches, because I don't know if people get a sense of their own depths, where are they going to go with that? Mm. And so a couple of examples that come to mind, like one of those was a group of policemen. And they first got in touch because they had a real problem with aggression within their unit. Right now, bear in mind, these were policemen who were dealing with drug-related juvenile violent crimes, right? So it's a very specific and somewhat grim area that that everybody, including me, had assumed that there's a certain amount of stress just built into that job.
Right.
But the reason they first got in touch and were willing to have this conversation was because they had a lot of problems with aggression in their homes. They felt that they carried so much residue from their job that they didn't know how to switch off, and they didn't know how to regain warmth and connection. And they were afraid for the people they lived with. They really did feel that it was better for their kids and for their partners if they kind of stayed at a distance, because they were afraid of where they were mentally. And so that's how we first started. And I mean, for any of you who do go on to be coaches with this, like, it's often not popular when you walk into people who have these contexts that are very dramatic. And we're like, well, why don't you give me half a day? And we'll put that aside for half a day. I promise at 1 p.m. we will come back to all of this. But until then, and then you talk about where your experience of life comes from. Nobody wants to know, right? And so, like, take heart if you begin and you get lots of blank stares or fidgets, because, like, even till now, the most interesting projects I have begin like that. It begins with people who are like, well, my partner forced me to come. My boss said I have issues with anger or whatever. And so this room was like that. They just wanted to know, how can I reduce stress enough to feel that my family is safe around me when I go home? And we didn't talk directly about many of those things that morning. And so at the beginning, there's lots of like folded hands and lots of shuffling and the thing but here's the helpful thing about police departments, right? Like, at least in this particular department, the record keeping is meticulous. And hence, for me, as a person who just wanted to know what does it do in a crisis, that was great, because each person's name, I had a list in front of me with a number next to each person. And that was the number of aggression, incidents of aggression that person had in an average week, right? And, many of them were double-digit figures. And so we began to work here. And then I think we were maybe 5 weeks on, maybe 6. And one of the guys who really
doing like a half day a week, or what was when you say?
No, actually, so the way we started was to do 2 half days, about a week and a half apart. And then I would work with them in pairs. So that was that. Again, that was it's not a pre-established format that I use, but in that particular case, that's what we had done. And about 5 weeks on, he comes in, and this is 5 weeks into the thing. There's zero interest on his face. He has not had one day when he felt like coming in,
Right.
and one day when he felt like he got anything out of this. Okay, so he's pissed, right? But dutifully, he has kept coming because his wife has said to him, bro, you scare me. So go. You know, if this is going to help us, go. And so that's the reason he dutifully keeps turning up, right? And there's so much for me, like wisdom and kindness in just acknowledging that as well. That despite all of his misgivings about what he thought would help, and this was definitely not in that bucket, he really had enough care for his wife and for his kids and for what he was going through to just keep showing up. But then one day, 5 weeks in or whatever, we have another group session and he turns up front of class, right? So he's sitting in the bit where I never sit when I attention. You know, like he's right in the center, right in front of me, and he's engaged, and I can't hardly focus because I'm thinking, what the fuck has happened?
Yeah, what's he doing?
And so midway through another bit of teaching, I have to stop and say, I'm really sorry. I can't hardly think. Like, what's going on? What happened to you? And he then describes to me what has happened to him, which is that during that week, they had an incident, right? Where this particular young boy that they had been trying to arrest and catch in the act and whatever, who was causing a load of disruption in his community, somebody rang his desk to say they found him. And predictably, he's doing some shit that he shouldn't be doing. And so he gets this phone call. And before that, he's just sitting at his desk. And this is what he's relaying to me, right? That he's sitting there at his desk, he's doing some admin, no feelings about that, really. He's just doing some things. And then he gets this phone call and he says, by the time he stood up, he was pissed, right? And he said, but the boy wasn't even there, right? Nothing had happened. I was sitting down and now I'm standing. And I was pissed. And he said he could see for himself all of the thoughts he had about boys like this, about what they do to the community, about all his memories of all the families that have been affected, about all the news stories and all the heat his department is getting because of boys like this. And he says, no wonder by the time I get to the kid, I want to beat the hell out of him. But it was never about the kid.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. And that in its own way is going on for each of us. Yeah. Thanks, Mahima.